Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. I'm sure you'll agree that it's been a fantastic morning of panels and discussions and fireside chats, and we're all excited about what's ahead this afternoon. I do want to start our luncheon conversation by acknowledging all of the local, state, and elected officials who are committing their time to our children's future by being here today. So please join me in thanking all of those officials. Now, while enjoying the conference today, you may have noticed the beautiful mosaics displayed right outside in the foyer of the atrium. Those are here courtesy of our partner organization, Communities and Schools, which has a great mission. It's dedicated to surrounding students and communities of support to empower them to stay in school and achieve in life. So I encourage everybody to take a look in the foyer following the lunch. President Reagan believed, and we've heard this, saw this quoted earlier this morning, that education is not simply another part of American society, but it was the key that opened what he called the golden door to the American dream. And so for our children and for the future of our country, it is our responsibility to ensure we do everything within our power to pass the keys from one generation to the next. And as special guests for our luncheon today, we have two leaders who have worked tirelessly to guarantee that our next generation receives an effective and principled education, Senator Ted Cruz and Secretary Betsy Devos. As a citizen leader who has served on numerous national and local civic organizations like Kids Hope USA and the Kendall College of Art and Design, as the chairwoman of the Windcrest Group and an in-school mentor for at-risk children in the Michigan public school system, as a mother of four, and now as the 11th U.S. Secretary of Education. In all of these roles, Betsy Devos, whose mother was a public school teacher, has been a champion for students and a powerful voice for parents. For over 6 years, Ted Cruz has represented 28 million Texans in the United States Senate as a passionate fighter for our children's future. In addition to his candidacy for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination and his leadership in the fight to confirm principled constitutionalists to our courts, Senator Cruz secured historic school choice legislation to expand the 529 college saving plans, enabling parents to save for their children's K-12 public, private, and religious education. As a parent of five, I'm a beneficiary of such legislation. In November of 2018, Senator Cruz was reelected to the Senate by the people of Texas. To host our discussion, we're honored to have with us a lifelong advocate for education reform. He serves as the executive director of the Center for Advancing Opportunity, Mr. Gerard Robinson. They'll be here discussing the meaning of school choice for the future of public education. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Secretary DeVos, Senator Cruz, and Mr. Robinson.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good to see everyone. 36 years ago, we released A Nation at Risk. And we talked about what it did for the nation in terms of making sure that education was understood as a national priority. In the same year, a month later, very rarely do we talk about a speech that President Ronald Reagan delivered at Seton Hall University, where in that speech he talked about education, but he also mentioned tuition tax credits and vouchers. And he also mentioned the importance of parents in education. That was in 1983. Let's put this in context. There were not 43 states in the District of Columbia who had charter school laws in 1983, serving 3.2 million kids in 7,000 schools. There were not 54 publicly funded private school programs in the countries we have today right now in 26 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. Fast forward to 2019, the school choice, or what I like to call the parental choice landscape, looks radically different, both in the public and the private sector. And we have two people here who can talk to us about that. For those of you who are watching or listening, go to hashtag Rise2019 and let us know what you think. So I'm going to ask the first question to Secretary Devos. Good to see you here.
Great to see you, Gerard.
So there was a recent announcement from the Department of Education about a federal tax credit program. And just like for you to talk to us about what it's going to do, maybe the mission and why it's important at this time.
Well, thanks, Gerard, and thanks to the Institute for having us here today. The bottom line is that Education Freedom Scholarships, which is the overall name of the initiative, will ultimately mean a better education for more kids. And what it offers is a federal tax credit that individuals or corporations could take voluntary contributions to 501c3 organizations that states will designate. States can decide to participate in it or not, so no mandates, no new programs at the federal level, and states could then create or augment choice programs in their state to advance opportunities for kids that need it most. And I'm so grateful for Senator Cruz's leadership in this regard. The legislation has been introduced in both the Senate and in the House, and we're currently continuing to work on raising support for and sponsors of this legislation. But we've really encouraged people to think very broadly about what choice can mean. And I'm sure that Senator Cruz will comment on this as well, but think about enhancing career and technical education opportunities, or expanding apprenticeship opportunities, or dual enrollment opportunities in high school, or transportation to one of these kinds of programs. Think very broadly about what it would mean for every kid in a state to be able to find the right fit for them and for their future.
So, Senator, you've been a big supporter of parental choice for many years, even before you moved to Washington, D.C. Talk to us about what you were thinking 2017, it's time to push for student opportunity amendment. Talk to us about that, and then also share with us, what does it take once something's signed into law? That's the great part. Now what?
Well, sure. Let's first reflect on, as you open this, just how far we've come. Like many of the people in this room, I've been involved in the school choice movement for a couple of decades now. And the difference, 20, 30 years ago, we were arguing mostly theoretically. We were arguing mostly if you create choice, if you expand competition, it will benefit students and it will benefit the public schools. And at the time, the principal argument marshaled against choice was that it would hurt, and indeed often it was framed as it would destroy the public schools for there to be another choice for kids to have. The nice thing is we look at the scenario today is we've seen school choice programs implemented across the country. This is no longer theoretical. We now know that the arguments they marshaled against choice aren't true. We know that when you expand choices, when you expand options, when you give kids new opportunities, two things happen. Number one, those kids who get the new opportunities, they benefit. They get higher test scores. They get greater graduation rates. They get greater rates of going to college. Their entire opportunity is transformed. But number two, we know that competition works and it benefits the public schools. That when you expand choices, the quality of the education in the public schools for the students who don't exercise choice but are in the school system facing competition, their education improves as well. That is a much stronger ground from which we can argue now, because we know that this is about improving education for every student. Now, this latest initiative, the legislation I introduced, working hand in hand with the administration, with Secretary Devos, is a federal tax credit. One of the more successful approaches we've seen adopted in the states is tax credits for contributions to scholarship granting organizations. This at the federal level is the same thing. Now, there were a number of principles that we sat down and wanted to follow at the outset. One was to respect federalism. Neither Betsy nor I wanted a federal top-down program that trampled on the authority of the states and the people. So this is designed to be an opt-in program, so any state can make the decision whether to participate or not. And on the K through 12 side, it is $5 billion a year in federal tax credits. So over 10 years, that's $50 billion. Even in Washington speak, $50 billion is a lot of money. And for states that opt in, for individuals or corporations that make contributions to scholarship granting organizations, that the states will set up the rules for how they're governed, they get a dollar-for-dollar tax credit on their federal tax bill. What this will do is unleash a torrent of new resources for scholarships, for opportunity to expand choice. And the way the legislation is drafted, the feds have zero authority to impact curriculum in any way. And the only constraints are that states implementing this can't discriminate. So they can't discriminate on the basis of faith. They can't discriminate against religious schools. They can't discriminate against private schools. Whatever systems they set up have to allow the students and parents to have choice. And it's designed, as I said, to bring new resources into education and to bring them in a way that they're expanding competition to improve quality.
Both of you mentioned the importance of the state and understanding the appropriate role for the federal government. One of the great assets you bring to the role as secretary is you've seen a lot of this work at the state level. Are there some examples of state programs, tax credit or otherwise, that you'd want to share that we can take a look at for people who aren't familiar with how this works?
Well, there are a number of states that have taken great steps to offer more choices for kids to find the right fit for their education. I often point to Florida because I think Florida is probably the most advanced in terms of comprehensive reforms, both in the public school framework, as well as introducing opportunity through choice, tax credit scholarship programs, programs for students with special needs, for a variety of choice programs that have been implemented there. And it's very interesting to note that in the most recent NAEP results that we have, Florida has continued to show the most gains for the lower deciles of individuals, right along with those in the upper deciles. And I think about a study that was just released, I think last week, a joint study between Harvard and Stanford professors that has studied the last 50 years of federal investment in education, and the fact that in spite of over $1.2 trillion being expended, that gap has not closed substantially. It hasn't closed at all for those at the lowest economic levels and lowest performing, and those at the higher performing levels. And so one has to really ask oneself, what is the real role of the federal government long term in education? And I would argue, this administration would argue, it is really the state's prerogative and role to be directing what has to happen in their states. And we see great improvements in states like Florida. Indiana has had some significant advances as well. Arizona, Georgia. We could start naming a host of them. But the bottom line is, in every case, there is still far more demand for these opportunities than there are opportunities to be had. And so this initiative around a tax credit at the federal level, I think, is critical to continuing to push the momentum and boost the momentum around offering more choices for more kids.
And that's a good point, because your initiative can help close the opportunity gap, the demand for and access to. So, Senator, you mentioned the importance of research. You're right, back in the 80s, it was more theoretical. We know today from work from Patrick Wolf and Jay Green at the University of Arkansas, a ton of scholars, AEI as well, who said the research is pointing in the right direction. And yet there's still people who say we don't think it matters, that somehow it still doesn't matter. How do you respond to people who say that?
Well, look, I think we have made massive advances, and to continue making advances, we need to expand our coalition. We need to bring in new allies. And so let me look briefly, retrospectively, and then look prospectively. Retrospectively, one of the things that was mentioned a minute ago is the legislation that I passed on 529s. It's worth looking back and reflecting how that happened. Now, that was part of the tax cut bill that we passed in 2017. And it was an amendment that I introduced. It became the only amendment on the Senate floor that was adopted that added anything to the tax bill. And what the amendment did is it took college 529 savings plans, tax advantage plans that are immensely popular, about 18 million Americans use them right now, and it expanded them to say, parents and grandparents, you can still save for college, but now you can save for K through 12 education as well. You can save for public school, private school, religious school, parochial school, your choice, up to $10,000 per child per year. So the vote, when it played out on the Senate floor, it was actually after midnight. It was about 1 in the morning that the vote played out. And there's a bit of drama, which if you don't mind, I'll share the story because you may enjoy of how this got passed.
Drama in Congress, really?
So we had at the time 52 Republicans in the Senate. One Republican votes no, Susan Collins, and then a second Republican, Lisa Murkowski, votes no. Now, when that happened, the Senate floor staff picked up the phone. They called the Vice President's office. It's 1 in the morning. They said, Mr. Vice President, it looks like we may have a tie. We need you to come down. So Vice President Pence got in the motorcade, started heading down to Capitol Hill. I'm standing there with Lisa trying to convince her to change her vote. And actually working alongside me was Tim Scott, who he and I are both passionate about choice, and we're both trying to make the case to Lisa, look, this is your money. Don't you think you ought to be able to save your money for your kids? We're making the case passionately. And actually, Tim used to, in the private sector before the Senate, he used to help set up 529 plans. And so he was talking to her about how these operate. Well, while we're talking, behind me walks Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, and he votes yes. There's an audible gasp in the well of the Senate. Senate floor staff picks up the phone. They call the Vice President's office. They said, Mr. Vice President, we just got Manchin. It looks like we don't need your vote after all. So Pence turns the motorcade around, begins heading back to the residence. Joe returns to his desk, and a sea of Democrats descends upon him. They begin yelling at him. They begin beating him with sticks. Joe Biden gives him a back rub. And 5 minutes later, Manchin sheepishly walks down to the front and shifts his vote to a no. So the Senate floor staff again, they pick up the phone. They call the Vice President's office. He turns the motorcade around yet again. It's about 20 minutes from the Naval Observatory to Capitol Hill. About 20 minutes later, Vice President walked onto the floor, ascended to the chair, and said, the ayes being 50, the nays being 50, the Senate being equally divided, the presiding officer votes in the affirmative, the amendment is adopted. And with that, we passed what is the most far-reaching federal school choice legislation that has ever passed. Now, it was interesting. The next week I was talking with Lamar Alexander, who chairs the Education Committee. He's been involved in these issues a long, long time. And he was shaking his head and marveling. He said, there were a bunch of Republican senators who voted yes, who historically have been really tough votes on choice. And part of it, I think, was earnestly making the case and winning over allies. That is important, making the case on the merits. By the way, for every one of you in the states, in state legislatures, there is a great opportunity right now with that 529 legislation to pass state legislation that amplifies it. A number of states have, for example, state tax credits for contributions to 529s. Now, sadly, you're seeing some blue states passing legislation wanting to penalize parents who contribute to 529s for K through 12. I mean, that's just nuts. But there is an opportunity in the states to amplify the effect of this legislation now so that 529s become a more potent savings tool. Now, to pass Betsy's and my legislation now, we're going to have to broaden the coalition, and in particular, we're going to have to start picking off Democrats. If it stays a straight partisan issue, which right now In Congress, it is almost entirely a partisan issue. We're not going to pass it if it's a straight partisan issue. We've got, particularly with the Pelosi House, but we're not going to overcome a filibuster in the Senate. It's one of the reasons why in my bill there is a separate tranche that is another $5 billion for a year for workforce and apprenticeship training. Same thing as the K through 12, but it's dollar-for-dollar tax credits for contributions to scholarship-granting organizations for workforce and apprentice. And the reason is to try to pick off and build the support of blue-collar unions that are typically Democratic allies and power centers, that if we can start changing the calculus so that for elected Democrats it becomes more and more appealing to support this, that's the only way I see getting something as major and fundamental like this through the Congress.
You mentioned bipartisanship, and we know that for many years at the state level, both on the charter school front and the private school front, it was bipartisan support. Whether it was Ann Duplessis and a Bad Dawn, Louisiana, who helped vouchers move forward, or a pretty strong charter school piece. When we think about equity and opportunity in education today, often when you hear equity, you think about the role of attorneys and courts in the process. You think of opportunity, you think of buildings, and you think of process. One constituency we often overlook when we think of equity and opportunity are our parents. Parental choice has really changed how parents interact with school systems, moving them from an active to, from a passive to an active actor. How have both of you seen choice really empower parents to think differently, not only about education, but also the social capital for themselves?
Well, I always enjoy and appreciate meeting parents who have been empowered and have been able to see their child's trajectory changed because of that empowerment. And it's, I think, very instructive to note that the support amongst the population in general has continued to rise around the support for choice. And every demographic group that you look at supports more than 2/3, many into the 70 percentile. And so while it's difficult to convince a lot of politicians of the wisdom of this for obvious reasons, a lot of very entrenched forces protecting the status quo, the reality is that the people are more and more beginning to demand this, and I think the more parents that are able to access the choices that they want for their children and are empowered as a result, the more difficult it's going to be to thwart this momentum in that direction.
And the point of families and the public in polls have shown this. Education Week, AEI, even the report we do at the Center for Advancing Opportunity. So there's a rising tide. Senator, you mentioned, to go back to a point about the politics of it, why can't we just make this an education issue and not a political issue?
Well, I mean, the politics of it are pretty simple, which is that the teachers' unions are adamantly opposed to expanding choice, and far too many elected Democrats are terrified to do something that the teachers' unions disagree with, that they're too important of a funding base and a manpower base politically. If you look at the people, support for choice is strong and growing. If you look in minority communities, African-American communities, Hispanic communities, consistently you see 60, 70, sometimes 80% supporting choice, supporting giving their kids better opportunities. And so how we get this done, I think we need to be both incremental and transformational. And this legislation we worked on together is designed to do that. It's one of the virtues of the opt-in. With the opt-in, and listen, there's some in the choice movement that wish it wasn't an opt-in. That was a vigorous discussion. Do you make it an opt-in or not? One of the benefits of making it an opt-in, it means there's at least a chance of getting some Democrats on board to say, look, if your state doesn't want to do it, you don't have to. Nobody's going to force you to do it. It's up to you. That gives the chance for incremental growth. My bill is designed so you can opt into either tranche. So let's take a bright blue state. Let's take a New York or California. If the bill passed, presumably what would be likely to happen is they would initially opt into the workforce and the vocational piece, but not the K through 12. If typical party politics plays out the way it does, all right, that'd be fine. But this is designed then to have growing political pressure. You're talking about parents and kids being mobilized. In many ways, this is designed as a reverse of Obamacare. Think of Obamacare and the Obamacare Medicaid expansion. About 2/3 of the states have expanded Medicaid under Obamacare, about 1/3 haven't. Texas, my home state, has not. Every year there is pressure, real pressure on the non-Medicaid expansion states from their constituents saying, look at all this free money from the feds we're leaving on the table. This is designed to put that same pressure, let's say in New York, if they don't take the K through 12 initially. That then sets up New York parents and New York kids to go and say, why are we leaving this money and letting it go to other states when our kids could be benefiting from it? And so it is designed to be both incremental, but because of the competition element, also transformational at the same time.
When both of you speak of choice, or parental choice in particular, it's both in the public school sector and the private school sector. Here's what's interesting. We expect schools to do a lot today, just a ton of things. I take what I call a civil society approach, that it cannot be public schools alone or private schools alone. It's going to take nonprofit organizations, for-profit sector, faith-based community. What role do you see non-government actors playing, not only in legislation that you're mentioning, but in the work that you do to advance choice?
Well, I think there's a great opportunity for nonprofits and charitable organizations to come alongside of schools that are serving, kids in that community, and I think that's one of the areas where, culturally in general, we have a lot to be gained. A lot of community institutions and the core of a lot of communities have in many ways been hollowed out because I would say because of a continued sucking by the federal government in an intrusion into a lot of the areas that the federal government was never meant to be a part of. And so the more there is empowerment at that local level in the family to begin with parents and students, the more opportunity there is for those institutions around them to provide additional services or supports to grow up and be strong as well. And the more the federal government steps out of those things, the better.
I think you also have different players that can be engaged in helping pass this legislation, helping build the support for it moving forward, whether across the faith community. We worked hard and have the support of the Catholic bishops, of the Orthodox Jewish community. I mean, finding different constituencies across the spectrum who are engaged. We're getting the support of more and more blue-collar unions and trade unions, and that, I think, is a very important piece for changing the political calculus. I think the more we can get pressure within minority communities from African American and Hispanic parents whose kids are often facing the most acute crises, to speak out and demand of their elected officials, we need hope. I have believed my entire life, I think school choice is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And it is, every other right is dependent on education. If a kid gets a good education, everything else flows from that. Every other societal challenge, whether it's poverty, whether it's crime, whether it's drug abuse, whether it's health care, if a kid gets a good education, they've got a lot better chance of overcoming all of those challenges. Whereas if they don't get a good education, we know all of those challenges are much, much more likely to afflict that child going forward. And so the urgency, getting players to change the political calculus right now for too many Democratic members of Congress, it's a simple question of, nope, teachers' unions don't want to do it, and I can't cross them. Where we've seen communities that have adopted choice programs on the local level or on the state level, it has been because that coalition has changed the political calculus so that you suddenly had office holders that said, hey, wait a second, the upside here is bigger than the downside. That's what we've got to do nationally, is increase the upside, and I think groups coming together and calling on their elected officials is a huge part of that.
And if I could just piggyback off of that, Ted, what you mentioned earlier about the fact that where there are robust numbers of choices, the public schools get better as a result. And I think that's one thing that the opposition to choice continues to try to beat back on. Florida has had plenty empirical studies that have demonstrated in communities where a high number or high percentage of kids are choosing schools other than their assigned one, all of the achievement levels of the kids in the traditional public schools get better. And the reality is that schools make choices and changes based on what they see happening down the street or a half mile away that they weren't willing to make before. And it's to the benefit of children, and it's the benefit of our future, ultimately.
And it's worth also underscoring that the most frequent argument against choice is that you're taking money from the public schools. This federal tax credit doesn't take a penny from the public schools, and indeed could well be sending substantial additional dollars to the public schools. It's up to the states how to set it up, but the choice can include charters, it can include public options, so it is new money, new revenue being devoted to children's education, and the biggest argument on the other side is defanged because not a penny of it is coming out of existing money for the public schools.
In 2019, we have more choices than we did in 1983. But we had some in 1983. We had magnet schools. We had exam schools. We later, towards the end of the 80s, started advising people to have open enrollment. So the choice idea has been in both the public and the private sector. But now we're looking at a much more robust aspect of choice and what it looks like. The role of the federal government in a national conversation about education being a national priority, which is different than a federal priority. Distinction with a difference. But what I want to do is to thank both Secretary DeVos and Senator Ted Cruz for their time today on stage, talking with us about parental choice and what it means for our national priority, but also a reminder to the states that at the end of the day, this is state and local work. We want to thank all of our teachers, principals, school superintendents, and board members who have to make decisions about how this will play out, but also our state chiefs who are responsible for one way or another making this happen. So with that, let's give a round of applause for our two speakers. I thank the Ronald Reagan Institute for hosting this event, and I would definitely recommend all of you go back and watch the 1983 commencement speech or read the transcript of it from Seton Hall. Quite interesting. Thank you.